Hello, welcome to lecture 2. As you remember, this lecture is about understanding brain shape. So, how can we understand brain shape? Why is it like that? Why is it like brain has two hemispheres and there is a spinal cord and cerebellum? How has brain evolved in this fashion? So, in the first segment of this lecture, we began with the general question of brain's overall shape intelligence. We began with the case of Einstein's brain, and we looked at all these anatomical studies, and finally we concluded that gross anatomy does not tell you much about intelligence. So, then we went on to look at maybe brain's mass, or brain mass to body weight ratio, or any of these things correlate well with intelligence, and none of them were really working very well. Then we came up with this measure called encephalization quotient, and so we found that number is highest for human species compared to other species, but even that was not very satisfactory because it seems to be some kind of a fit, right. We came up with some figure which is highest for humans, so that is not really very convincing. So, in the second segment we looked at the save wire principle. So, we found that lots of brains satisfy this constraint of wire minimization, and we also said that that kind of a constraint arises in our electrical engineering when you design large circuits. So, now but that also did not really answer the question of the connection between brain structure and intelligence. So, now let us look at slightly different question. We will look at how brain's evolution has occurred. So, that is what we will see in the segment 3. So, basically we look at these questions in this segment. So, what are the different types of nervous systems? So, when we started off in the earliest organisms of in the evolution, they do not have a brain and spinal cord, they have something called a diffuse nerve net, they have just a bunch of neurons scattered all over the body. So, a brain spinal cord comes much later in evolution. So, why has it evolved like that? Has it got anything to do with intelligence that that kind of a species exhibits? So, what is the logic of this kind of structure? What kind of a forces, what kind of a logic shapes nerve systems from the primitive condition of a diffuse nerve net to the current condition in humans with a brain and a spinal cord. So, then we will also see if what is the correlation between the type of nervous system that an organism has or a species has and the kind of intelligence that the species exhibits. So, let us begin with a simplified evolutionary tree. So, the tree, what is called the tree of life. Tree of life, there are very complex versions. I am taking a very simple version to present some preliminary arguments. So, let us look at this tree of life. At the bottom of it you have what are called protists. These are single cell organisms, very primitive, and one of the first branches from protists is what is called protophytes, and these protophytes go on to become what we know as plants and trees. Then on the left side you can see these protozoans, which are also single cell organisms, and if you go slightly further up you have on the right side branching out you have coelenterates, right, and one of the a good example of that is hydra, and we look at that in a moment. And on the left branch again you see sponges. Right now both sponges and coelenterates are multicellular organisms, but sponges do not have any nervous system per se, right, and whereas coelenterates do have nervous system. Then as you go higher up you have worms and you have insects, then crustaceans like crabs, then you have arachnids, spiders, then you have mollusks. A good example of mollusk is an octopus, or a more familiar example is a snail that you see everywhere. Then you have on the left side you have echinoderms. These are like they have very nice symmetries, like starfish is an example of an echinoderm. Then you have this great branch of vertebrates at the end of which we have emerged, humans have emerged. So, on the vertebrate branch you have the fishes, then fishes move out of the water and enter the land, and they become amphibians, right, like frogs and alligators and all that. And then we have then two great branches from there. One branch is reptiles, snakes and lizards and so on, and dinosaurs are a prominent and a classic example of reptiles. And from reptiles, from the flying dinosaurs you have birds, right, at the end of it you have birds. Then the other great branch other than reptiles is mammals, and after that you see all these four-legged animals that you see everywhere, and one of the branches of mammals is apes and then humans. So, let us look at an example from coelenterates, hydra. Now, hydra, you can see the picture of hydra on the right side, and it has kind of a stem like structure, and at the top of it you have a bunch of finger like extensions, and you also see a small orifice right at the in the middle of that those finger like structures. So, Hydra do have a nervous system, but it's basically a bunch of neurons scattered all over its body, and this kind of nerve net is called a diffuse nerve net, and lots of neurons are concentrated around this orifice, which is actually the mouth of the of the organism. And so, it ingests food through this mouth, and also whatever is digested is excreted back through the same orifice. So, and it has a strange kind of locomotive behavior. So, with these tentacles which act like hands and feet, it moves around through a kind of a strange somersaulting movement. So, and there are no ganglia like some of the higher organisms we will see soon have clusters of neurons which are called ganglia, but Hydra does not have any ganglia, it just has this diffuse nerve net, and it also has specialized cells for touch and chemical detection. Then let us look at jellyfish, which is also another example of coelenterate. It has a nice symmetrical structure, it looks like kind of a umbrella with strands hanging down, and the jellyfish also has a nerve net which is of the type diffuse nerve net. So, this nerve net conveys or conducts neural impulses around the entire body of the jellyfish. It has tentacles for hunting, it has uses stomach, the kind of a vibrations of the stomach or for locomotion, for vertical locomotion, and so it has structures called rhopalia, which are act like sensory organs. So, they can sense and then they have light sensing structures called ocelli, and then they can sense balance through what are called statocysts. They can detect chemicals. So, they have some primitive kind of olfaction, and they can sense touch through structures called lappets. So, thing is both the examples that we have seen which are examples of coelenterate have very interesting kind of symmetry. This is called radial symmetry, they look like a flower pot. So, there are organisms exhibit different kinds of body plans on the overall organization of the body. So, for example, something like a sponge, right, which does not have any specific symmetry, these are asymmetrical. So, you see the example, then the two examples we have seen of coelenterate, they exhibit radial symmetry. So, around an axis they are equally distributed in all directions approximately. So, and these kinds of organisms typically have a diffuse nerve net, which is interesting. That means the body structure and the kind of nervous system that the organism has some connection. But beyond that, if you go beyond coelenterate, very quickly you run into organisms which have what is called a bilateral symmetry. So, there is a kind of a box like structure, and then there is a left side to it and right side to it. So, then it has a, so the front is called anterior side and back is called the posterior, and the upper part which becomes the back of the animal in higher animals is called the dorsal side, and the lower part is the ventral side. So, there is a plane of symmetry which passes through the middle of the organism in the anterior posterior direction, and this is a vertical plane, and on both sides of the plane the animal body is roughly symmetric, is roughly equivalent on both sides. What is interesting is organisms which radial kind of symmetry, they do not move much, they do not have very extreme kind of locomotory capabilities, whereas animals with different body plan, the bilateral symmetric body plan move a lot more. So, let us look at one more example, the earthworm, so which comes into the branch of worms. So, earthworm also has a nervous system, but now the nervous system is slightly of a higher kind in evolution. And these are called chains of ganglia. So, here you do not have a diffuse individual neurons distributed all over the body and are loosely connected, but these neurons are clumped together into small masses, and these masses are called ganglia, and they form a chain, and you have chains of ganglia kind of nervous system. So, these ganglia control the wreathing movements of the earthworm, and then typically there is a slightly larger and prominent set of pair of ganglia in the front of the animal close to what you call the head, right, and this helps the organism in eating and digging, and then all over the body of the organism there is a chain of ganglia which control the locomotion, the local control the movements of the local parts of the body. Then let us look at octopus. Octopus is an example of a mollusk. It is a very interesting animal, it is actually a pretty smart animal, right, and so the kind of nervous system it has is actually a transition between the previous type of nervous system where we saw a chain of ganglia, and the next kind of nerve system where you find a huge clump of neurons forming something like a precursor to the brain that as we know it, right. So, it has a brain like head ganglion, this big ganglion that it has in the head is called head ganglion, and then this seems to be represent the transition from the chains of ganglia to the brain like nerve system. And octopus exhibit very interesting capabilities. In fact, it occupies the highest position in the invertebrate hierarchy. So, it is probably one of the smartest organisms in the invertebrate hierarchy. They can exhibit observational learning. So, people who have studied behavior of octopuses, in one study they found that they taught one octopus to distinguish between two colored balls, say red and white. So, whenever it picked the red ball, they gave it a little reward, and whenever it picked the white ball, it gave it a little punishment. So, after some exposure to this kind of stimuli, the organism learned to pick up always the red ball. Then they allowed another octopus to observe this whole training process. So, after that, then they presented these two balls to the new animal which has been only observing, but never got directly trained, and the new animal also started choosing the red over the white balls. So, this is called observational learning. It is considered a very high form of learning, and octopuses do observe that, do exhibit that. Now, they also exhibit playful behavior. So, people have observed octopuses, for example, they throw an object into flowing water and then pick it up back again with tentacles, throw it again, pick it up back. So, this kind of a activity does not serve any purpose. So, that is like play. The octopus is just having fun, and then they can classify simple patterns. And an extreme example of this kind of a thing actually, or maybe even an absurd example, octopuses have been used to predict the winners of World Cup soccer in 2010, and this octopus called Paul had actually predicted the winner quite correctly. So, that may be just a joke, but they do exhibit a very interesting and very intelligent behavior. So, this picture shows the kind of nervous system organization of an octopus. It has a brain like central mass of neurons, right. So, you do not see those kind of chains of little ganglia all over the body, but they all come together into a big concentrated mass of neurons, and from there you have strands of neural tissue. These are reminiscent of what we now know as spinal cord in higher animals, right, and these strands of neural tissue run along all the tentacles, right, and control the movements of the tentacles. So, octopus nervous system represents a transition from the chains of ganglia to what is called a brain and spinal cord, right, type nervous system. Now, let us look at fish. So, in fish you have entered the vertebrate branch, and one of the lowest organisms in the vertebrate scale. You do not think much of a fish's intelligence, but that is what people thought for a long time, but recent studies have shown that fish also are very intelligent. For example, they can learn to navigate mazes. So, maze learning is something that you attribute to higher mammals. So, there is a lot of maze learning studies that are done on rats and mice, for example. So, if you leave a rat in a complicated maze and it runs around for a little while and then learns the route to escape from the maze outside. So, a lot of studies have been done, and a part of the brain called hippocampus which is there in mammals is thought to contribute to this kind of a learning. But even goldfish were shown to be able to learn mazes, right, and find their way around in mazes. So, they exhibit spatial learning which is thought to be present only in higher mammals. So, in fish nervous system again you see a brain spinal cord kind of structure. Obviously, the brain is very small because fish itself is very small, but in the brain you see again small substructures appearing. It is not just like one big mass of neurons, but you see the little bumps, right. The two bumps in the very front of it, in the anterior end, and they form the cerebrum, right, which is what we understand as brain in humans, right. And then after that you see another bigger bump called the cerebellum, which you see all through the mammalian hierarchies in the nervous system, and at the end you have a spinal cord. So, then let us go up a little bit along the vertebrate hierarchy and go via the reptile branch and then go to the end of it, and you have birds. Now, birds are also generally not thought to be very intelligent. In fact, if you want to insult somebody, you say the person has a bird brain, but actually that is also not quite true, and studies over last few decades have shown that birds are very intelligent, and they have again brain and spinal cord kind of a nervous system. Only thing is the brain is small and spinal cord and in relative proportions is larger, because as you go to higher mammals you will find that the relative mass of brain increases with respect to spinal cord. So, it does not have what is like structure like cortex which is there in mammalian brains, but equivalent to that it has what is called a pallium, kind of a expanded portion of the brain in the forebrain. So, you can see that this is the cerebral hemisphere, this is called the pallium. And then birds exhibit very complex and intelligent behaviors. For example, birds can sing and also they can teach singing to their young. So, there is what is called a tutor bird, which can be a parent bird or some other elder bird, which teaches a young bird how to sing. And the young birds also can improvise, so they learn a few syllables and then they can string the syllables together in various sequences and come up with new songs that were not taught by their elders. It is almost like a classical musician improvising, right, and singing an alap. They can imitate each other, what is called duetting, and they have very rich pattern classification capabilities. For example, pigeons were found to classify over 700 patterns, which is a very large number, and birds also can count. So, for example, crows were found to count up to 3, which is not much, when parrots up to 6, cormorants up to 8, and a green heron it was found can throw a piece of bread as a bait to catch fish. So, to use a third object to interact with a second object in certain way is considered very smart. So, or a wedge-tailed eagle can use stones to break eggs. Again, you can see the same thing, use a third object to act on a second object, right. That is called tool use, and tool use is something that is that marks a very great stage in human evolution, and people have learned to make weapons by sharpening sticks or stones, and that was considered a great stage in human evolution. But later on people found that even chimps can show that kind of behavior, they show tool use. The tool use is generally considered a sign of intelligence in the animal world. So, even birds can show tool use. So, so again you can see here that the brain of the bird, nervous system of the birds have this brain and this cord kind of a structure. So, if you look at the brains of these last 3 organisms that we have encountered, a fish, a reptile and a bird. So, you see all of them have a brain spinal cord kind of a nervous system, and if you go higher and higher up, you see that the cerebrum part of the nervous system gets bigger and bigger. So, we will see that more as you go to mammals. So, let us look at some mammals. So, you have rats, chimpanzee and humans. So, these are located in this branch of they have a tree of life. So, rats again they have a brain spinal cord kind of a nervous system. They have very complex, they can exhibit very complex capabilities. They can learn mazes. They can distinguish between cardinality and ordinality. So, cardinality is numbers, that is 1, 2, 3, it is a question of magnitude, whereas ordinality first, second, third is a question of sequence, right. As you, for example, a first house or a second house or a third house in a street, that is ordinality. Cardinality is basically like 1 apple, 2 apples, 3 apples, that is cardinality. So, rats were able to distinguish between these 2 kinds of concepts. Some rats also were found to use pesticide, some kind of a chemical, right, which will keep bugs off their beds. So, that is some example of a tool use. Now, when you go from rats to humans, right, one thing that you notice is they both have obviously the brain and spinal cord kind of structure, but in rats the relative volume of brain is smaller than in humans. For example, the volume of cerebral cortex, the surface of the brain, right, is 31% in rat, whereas in humans it is 77%. Okay, so, you see although both have a brain spinal cord kind of a structure, the brain part gets larger in humans compared to rats. So, chimpanzee has also a brain spinal cord, but the now brain volume starts increasing, right, compared to its lower mammalian cousins. So, capabilities, chimpanzees show tool use, and in fact this was discovered almost half a century ago by Jane Goodall, right, who travelled from Europe to Africa to study the behavior of chimpanzees. And when she first saw a chimpanzee sticking a kind of piece of twig into a pit, an ant pit, and to termite pit, and so when the chimpanzee pulled out the twig and there were termites stuck to the entire twig and it could eat the termites. So, it is using a twig as a tool to access the termites. So, that is an example of tool use, and it was a big revelation at that time when she discovered that, and later on a lot more was discovered. And chimpanzees also have an excellent working memory capabilities. They could learn sign language, because they do not have the vocal apparatus to produce human like sounds, but they can learn sign language by signing with their hands and by gestures. So, one particular animal which was trained right on sign language, it is called Washoe, right, could learn 132 words using signs, and Washoe was also allowed to adopt a smaller chimp, and the Washoe was able to teach the smaller chimp, the adopted chimp, a lot of these words without any human intervention. So, that is bordering on what a human being or a civilized human being is capable of doing. So, if you look at the cerebrum in an organism which is below the mammalian branch, right, so it looks very smooth, right, where been well rounded, whereas the cerebrum in mammals starts showing all these convolutions, these folds. So, these folds increase the surface area of the brain, and surface area of the brain in mammals has this sheet of neurons called the cortex, and the more greater the number of folds, the bigger the area of this sheet, and that seems to be correlated with the kind of intelligence that the organism which has it is capable of expressing. So, whereas in ape again there is a cerebrum, but it has greater folds and it is bigger in volume, and this trend continues all the way up to humans. So, in humans again there is cerebrum and so on, but there are folds, and the folds are a lot thicker and deeper and more complex, giving us a very high cortical area. So, here again the minimum wire principle is satisfied. So, if you apply the minimum wire principle to these brains, can we explain the organization or the emergence of these different types of nervous systems? So, that is simply by invoking the minimum wire principle, can we show how we can go from the nerve nets or the diffuse nerve nets when you have a small number of neurons in a nervous system, whereas as you add more and more neurons, as a nervous system grows in size with more and more neurons, right, nervous system does it actually evolve into chains of ganglia and cortices and brains and cords and so on and so forth. So, let us look at that. So, some of the different organizations that we have seen in our discussion so far is in Hydra, which is a cnidarian which has a diffuse nerve net, then a sea star which has a central ring, but does not have a kind of a brain proper, does not have a concentrated mass in the center, right, just as a ring like structure of neurons, and then there are these strings of strands of nerve tissue going out in order into its along its tentacles. Then you have planarium which has chains of ganglia. So, then B also has a segmental ganglia. A mollusk has a beginning of a centralized brain, and then if you look at other say birds and fish and reptiles, they all have a centralized brain and spinal cord, and then mammals also have similar nervous system. We have broadly seen 4 kinds of nervous system: chains of the diffuse nerve net, chains of ganglia, brain spinal cord, where the brain part is smaller, spinal cord is bigger. So, a small brain, large cord, and later on it becomes a large brain, small cord. So, can we explain the evolution of these different types of nervous system by invoking the save wire principle? So, let us look at a kind of a hypothetical organism. Okay. So, you have just box like animal which has 2 eyes in the front, in the anterior end, and it has 2 legs, and we will endow it with a single neuron. Let us start with a very simple nervous system which has single neuron, and this neuron is connected to both the eyes E1 and E2, and is also connected to both the legs L1 and L2. So, if you invoke the minimum wire principle, where would this neuron be? So, you can see that it should be somewhere in the middle. So that the total length of all the wires connecting the neuron to the ends of the body, right, that becomes minimum. Because if you take this neuron too close to the eyes, and the length to the legs becomes longer, so that will not be minimum. Or if you, on the other hand, if you take it too close to the legs, the length to the eyes becomes much longer, and on the whole it will not be minimum. So, it should be somewhere in the middle. But then what happens if you have more wires connecting the neuron to the eyes as opposed to the legs? So, we have seen this kind of anterior posterior nerve fiber ratio generally much higher than 1. So, for example, in humans we saw that it is about 5 in the previous segment of this lecture. So, like that, if there are more wires connecting to the front as opposed to the legs, So then what happens? So since the more wires connected to the eyes, right, if the neuron is too far from the eyes, you will end up with lots of wire. So you have to move the neuron as far as possible as close as possible to the eyes, so that the overall wire length is minimized. So you see start seeing some kind of a brain or some kind of a concentration of neurons close to the sense organs, right, giving rise to some kind of brain like structure in the head. Now imagine that instead of one neuron, which is very silly, let us have more neurons, let us say two neurons, there are two neurons, but both neurons have the same kind of connectivity, right. So both neurons are connected to both the eyes in the same way. Each neuron is connected to each eye with two wires, and each neuron is connected to both the legs with only one wire each. So then again, since the problem is same as the previous problem, it's just that we are repeating it, right, we are posing it two times. So the same solution applicable to both the neurons. So both neurons will be at the same location. So you see that then they start clumping. So that is how ganglia start emerging. Then let's look at a slightly different situation. You have two neurons, but the two are connected differently to different parts of the body. So there is one neuron here, right, which is connected to the two eyes with one fiber each, and then there is another neuron which is connected to the two legs with one fiber each, and these two neurons are connected again. So with this kind of a nervous system, where would you place the neurons, right? So basically what is happening here is, when you try to minimize a wire with wire length to some target, right, you are trying to move towards the target. So in this case, the given neuron is basically attracted, right, by the eyes. So the neuron here is attracted by the two eyes in some sense, because it is trying to minimize the wire length, and it is also attracted towards other neuron because it is trying to minimize this wire length also. So it is under these conflicting forces, it will try to attain some kind of equilibrium position. The same thing is being done by the other neuron also. It is being attracted to the two legs and is also attracted to the other neurons. So this is what happens generally in nervous systems. The neurons are connected to each other, therefore they try to be as close as possible to each other, but they are also connected to the end organs, the sense organs or motor organs on the surface of the body. So they also try to move closer to the surface of the body. So these two forces shape the overall organization of the body, of the nervous system. So if you have more neurons, right, and then with a slightly different connectivity, for example, here we are introducing bilaterality, the effects of bilaterality of the body on the nervous system, right. So in this case, I have two neurons here. This neuron is connected to the E2 with two fibers, right, and like this, and but is connected to the IE1 with only one fiber. Okay, and similarly, this neuron is connected to E2 with only one fiber, but it is connected to E1 with two fibers. So therefore, this neuron will try to stay closer to E1, but slightly farther away from E2, and this neuron will try to stay closer to E2, but farther from E1, right. So you see that both neurons will start moving slightly to the sides of the body, giving the nervous system a kind of a bilateral structure. So the bilateral organization of the body seems to lead to a bilateral organization of the brain also. So similarly, you can see some kind of a bilaterality even in the neurons which control the legs. Now these are very simple, highly simplified artificial situations. But you can imagine how the same kind of principles could be operating in the evolution of and in the shaping the real nervous systems in real organisms. So we did some simple simulations to drive home this point more strongly. So in these simulations which were done by my student Karthik, so we have taken this kind of a simplified ideal organism which is like a box, like a rectangle, and the blue dots in the front are like the sense organs. You can call them whatever, you can call them eyes, ears, right, whatever, and the red dots on the right on both sides are like legs, or for example like caterpillar's legs. You have legs all along the body of length of the body on both sides. Now the black dots in the center are like neurons, right, there are lots of neurons, and then we have two parameters, sigma x and sigma y, which you can see on the right side. I am not going to explain the equations, and because in this course I promise that I am not going to use much mathematics. So we start off with some random initial locations of the neurons and let them run around, let them follow these two constraints, that is, each neuron is attracted towards the sense organs in the front and towards the motor organs on the right and left and towards each other. okay, and then wherever these attractions lead them and lead to some kind of equilibrium position, that is where the simulation stops. So, let us see what happens. So, you see that neurons have come together, they formed clumps, but these clumps are all over the place. Okay, it is like a diffuse nerve net. So, then let us look at the next example. So, here again we change this sigma x sigma y slightly and did the same simulation again. In this case something interesting happens. These clumps are formed, but they did not get concentrated in the middle of the body, right. They kind of moved to the sides of the body. In fact, they are lining up into small clusters along on the two sides of the body, which is vaguely reminiscent of the chains of ganglia that you see in a lot of invertebrates, with two parallel chains of ganglia, one and which are bilaterally organized, right, one on the left and one on the right. Then let us look at the third kind with brain spinal cord kind of thing. So, in this case again we change the parameters slightly. In this case, instead of the neurons, instead of clumping to the two walls, to the sides of the organism, they come to the middle, right, forming some, which is vaguely reminiscent of some kind of a spinal cord. At the top you have another big distribution or a cluster of neurons, these black dots, right, and that is reminiscent of a brain. So, let us look at the simulation one more time. So, that is right, you have all this agglomeration in the center which looks like a spine, and the big mass which is at the top which looks like the brain. So, you can kind of anticipate how the real nervous systems have evolved simply by trying to minimize the wire length, right, for the given organism. Okay, to summarize, we have said in the very beginning of this lecture in segment 1 that nervous system basically act as communication networks that enable the body to act as a whole, to respond as a whole to the inputs coming from the environment. So, they evolved through 4 broad architectures: a diffuse nerve net, then a chains of ganglia kind of a nerve system, then a small brain and large spinal cord, and a large brain small spinal cord. So, the organisms with the higher type of a nervous system can exhibit greater intelligence. What is higher type? So, for example, a large brain spinal cord, a large brain and a small spinal cord is better than a small brain and a large spinal cord, and then which is better than a chains of ganglia kind of nervous system, which again is better than diffuse nerve net. So, it is a question of what kind of nervous system an organism has, that will determine what kind of intelligence the organism can exhibit. So, that seems to be a more deciding factor rather than the simple evolutionary scale, because in evolutionary scales and the hierarchies of nervous system architecture are not tightly correlated, because we have seen that right in the evolutionary tree we have seen that right, an octopus, which is a mollusk, right, which is much lower than even vertebrates, right, can again show intelligent behavior just like a fish, right, or a bird. So, the evolutionary hierarchies are not that important, right. It is this broad class of nervous systems, the architecture of nervous system, that determines what kind of intelligent behavior that organism can exhibit. But having said that, it is not easy to make a very precise statement about the link between nervous system architecture and intelligence, because first of all what is intelligent is very relative. It depends upon the context, the milieu of that particular organism, right, and so therefore and then it is difficult to quantify that. So, and then even the complexity of a nervous system, we have just seen some patterns, but even that is very hard to quantify and right, kind of draw a plot between a number that characterizes the complexity of a brain and a number that characterizes the level of intelligence. So, because first of all, so we tried to we began with a kind of difficult question, maybe an impossible question, which is, can we understand intelligence completely by a structural analysis of the brain. So, we try to do whatever we can, we try to do our best. We have discovered some interesting answers, but that is not enough probably, because intelligence is not a question of gross structure, but something else. Because if you look at the computer language or computer metaphor, right, what a computer can do is not determined by its hardware, which is also necessary. It should be have enough RAM, enough hard disk space, and then enough sufficiently powerful processor and so on, but that itself is not enough. You need to have software. So, when it comes to a computer, we distinguish between hardware and software. So, in brain also we should learn to distinguish between these two, although it is not appropriate to just carry over the same ideas to brain, because in brain the difference between hardware and software it is not very clear, right. So, so unless we know more about brain, it is very hard to understand. what makes a brain intelligent. So, for that we need to get into neural activity, the activity of neurons, which means electrical activity of the neurons. So, let us move on to that in the next lecture. Thank you.